The mountains of western North Carolina rose like ancient sentinels against the pale sky of 1845, their peaks shrouded in mist that seemed to hold secrets older than memory itself. In these rugged highlands, where the Blue Ridge gave way to the Great Smoky Mountains, civilization existed as scattered pockets of human ambition carved reluctantly from an indifferent wilderness. Here, among the steep hollows and dense forests of laurel and rhododendron, the rules that governed the flatlands below seemed to fade into something more primal, more honest in its brutality. If you're finding this story as powerful as we hope, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you these forgotten histories every week, and your support helps us continue. Also, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. The plantation of Colonel Marcus Hendricks sprawled across a valley where the French Broad River carved its patient path through the earth. Unlike the sprawling cotton kingdoms of the Deep South, Hendricks's operation was a hybrid of industry and agriculture, a combination of crop cultivation and an iron forge that fed on the region's rich ore deposits. The forge's hammer rang out across the valley from dawn until dusk, a mechanical heartbeat that measured out the hours of bondage for the 63 enslaved people who called this place their hell. Among them was a man known only as Bob, no surname, no family name passed down through generations, just Bob, as if a single syllable could contain the entirety of a human soul. He was 28 years old in the spring of 1845, though the exact date of his birth remained unknown even to him. His mother had been sold away when he was 7, and with her went any connection to the stories that might have told him who he was before he became property. What remained was the body that Marcus Hendricks had purchased 12 years earlier, 6 feet of muscle and sinew that the colonel had acquired specifically for work at the forge. Bob's hands bore the evidence of his trade. Burns in various stages of healing marked his forearms like a map of his suffering, some old enough to have faded to pale scars, others still angry and red. His right palm carried a permanent brand, where molten iron had splashed during his first month at the forge, when he was still learning that hesitation around liquid metal was a luxury enslaved workers couldn't afford. The overseer, a wiry man named Cyrus Webb, had laughed as Bob plunged his hand into a water trough, the scream that tore from the young man's throat apparently some kind of entertainment. The forge itself was a cathedral of industrial suffering, stone walls held in heat that made the air shimmer even in winter, while in summer the temperature became something that could kill. 2 enormous bellows, operated by a system of pulleys and a water wheel, fed air to fires that glowed white-hot. Bob worked as the primary striker, wielding a sledgehammer that weighed 12 pounds, bringing it down in rhythm with the master smith's smaller hammer. The pattern was everything. 2 strikes from Bob's sledge, 1 from the smith's hammer, 2 more from the sledge. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The repetitive motion had rebuilt his body into something purpose-made for this single task, his shoulders and back corded with muscle, his hands calloused into leather. But it was his mind that truly marked Bob as different from many of the other enslaved workers on the Hendricks plantation. He possessed an intelligence that he'd learned early to hide, a capacity for observation and analysis that would have been dangerous if noticed. He'd taught himself to read by studying the markings on iron ingots and tools, matching the symbols to words he heard spoken. Over years, piece by piece, he'd assembled a literacy that he practiced only in the darkness of his cabin, using charcoal on scraps of wood that he burned each morning before dawn. Bob lived in the forge quarters, a long wooden structure that housed 8 men who worked the iron. Their cabin sat closer to the industrial buildings than to the fields where the majority of the plantation's enslaved population lived. This separation was strategic. Hendricks wanted his forge workers isolated from the field hands, believing that the skilled nature of their labor might give them ideas above their station. In truth, it only gave them a different kind of despair. They could see the mountains every day rising above the trees, promising freedom that remained forever out of reach. The spring of 1845 began with rain that seemed to have no end. The French Broad swelled beyond its banks, turning the valley's lower fields into shallow lakes. The forge continued to operate, but the dampness made everything harder. Coal refused to burn properly, metal cooled too quickly, and the air itself felt heavy with moisture that penetrated everything. Bob's cabin developed leaks, and he would lie awake at night listening to water drip onto the packed earth floor, each drop a small marker of time passing. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Bob first heard the stories. An enslaved man named Isaiah had been purchased by a neighboring plantation brought up from Georgia. Isaiah was older, perhaps 50, and he carried with him tales of the deep South that horrified even men who thought they knew the depths of slavery's cruelty. But more importantly, Isaiah brought stories of others who had escaped, not the sanitized tales that white people told of failed runaways quickly captured, but real accounts of people who had vanished into the mountains and survived. "There's gaps in the world," Isaiah said one night, his voice low as the 8 men huddled in their cabin after dark. "Places where their rules don't reach. Up in them high mountains, there's valleys they ain't never gonna find. Caves bigger than this plantation. Places where a man could live if he knew how." Bob listened but said nothing. He'd heard escape stories before, heard the hope in them and the despair that followed when men were dragged back in chains. The patrol system in western North Carolina was less organized than in the plantation regions further east, but it still existed. White men rode the roads looking for enslaved people without passes. The penalty for running was public whipping at minimum, often much worse. Bob had seen men tied to the whipping post in Hendrix's yard, had heard their screams, and watched their backs transform into raw meat. The colonel believed in making examples, but something about Isaiah's stories planted a seed. Not hope exactly. Bob had learned to distrust hope, but rather a cold calculation of possibilities. The mountains were real, the gaps in patrol coverage were real, and Bob possessed something that many enslaved people didn't. He knew how to work iron, how to make tools, how to create the implements that survival would require. A knife forged from stolen steel, a hatchet shaped during moments when Webb wasn't watching. These were possibilities worth considering. The beating that changed everything came on a Tuesday in late April. Bob had been working the forge for 9 hours straight, his arms aching with the familiar exhaustion that came with the job. A piece of iron in the fire had developed a flaw, a crack that Bob noticed when he pulled it from the coals. He pointed it out to Webb, who was overseeing the work that day. The overseer glared at the glowing metal, then at Bob, his face reddening with an anger that seemed to have no connection to the actual problem. "You questioning my judgment, boy?" Webb's voice was quiet, which was always more dangerous than when he yelled. "No, sir," Bob said, keeping his eyes down. "Just showing you the crack before we work it. Iron's flawed." What happened next made no logical sense, but logic had nothing to do with the power dynamics of slavery. Webb picked up a 3-foot length of iron rod, cold and solid, and swung it like a club. The metal caught Bob across the ribs with a crack that echoed through the forge. Bob went down, the air driven from his lungs, his body curling instinctively around the pain. "Don't you ever contradict me," Webb said, standing over him. "Flawed. You think you know iron better than me. You think being able to swing a hammer makes you something other than property." The beating continued, not with the systematic brutality of a formal whipping, but with the random violence of a man needing to reassert dominance. Webb kicked Bob twice in the back, then struck him again with the iron rod across the shoulders. The other workers in the forge stood frozen, knowing that interference would only spread the violence to them. When it ended, Bob lay on the forge floor, breathing in shallow gasps, each breath bringing new reports of damage from his body. 2 ribs cracked at minimum, maybe 3. His left shoulder felt wrong, possibly dislocated. Blood filled his mouth from a split lip. But worse than the physical pain was the realization that crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. This would never end. There would be no redemption, no kindness earned through compliance, no safety found in being valuable property. The system would grind him down until his body broke completely. And then Hendrix would purchase another enslaved person to take his place at the forge. They let Bob lie there for an hour before Isaiah and another man named Thomas helped him back to the cabin. Each step felt like knives in his chest. That night, as he lay on his rough pallet listening to his own labored breathing, Bob made his decision, not with hope or optimism, but with the cold certainty of a man who had finally calculated that the risk of death in the mountains was preferable to the guarantee of death by degrees in the valley. He began to plan, not frantically or desperately, but with the same methodical precision he brought to working iron. He would need tools, which meant stealing materials from the forge piece by piece. He would need food, which meant hoarding scraps over weeks. He would need knowledge of the terrain, which meant listening carefully to every story, every description of the mountains that came his way. And most importantly, he would need to wait for the right moment, a night when circumstances aligned to give him the maximum possible head start before his absence was noticed. The opportunity came sooner than expected. In early May, Colonel Hendrix announced he would be traveling to Asheville for a week of business. taking Webb with him. The plantation would be left in the care of the assistant overseer, a young man named Porter, who was known to be lazy and overly fond of whiskey. If Bob was going to run, this would be his window. The week before Hendrix's departure stretched like taffy, each day impossibly long despite Bob's attempts to maintain his usual routine. He forced himself to show no change in behavior, no hint of the calculations running constantly through his mind. He swung his sledgehammer with the same rhythm he'd maintained for 12 years, ate his meals with the same deliberate efficiency, spoke only when spoken to. The other men in the forge quarters sensed something different about him, a new stillness, a quality of focused attention, but they asked no questions. In the world of the enslaved, sometimes the kindest thing was to remain ignorant of another person's plans. Bob had been stealing for 3 weeks, though stealing seemed an inadequate word for taking back small pieces of the labor that had been stolen from him for years. A 6-inch piece of steel rod slipped into his pocket during a moment when the forge's chaos provided cover. A broken file that Webb had thrown aside as useless, which Bob retrieved from the scrap pile. A length of leather strap from a worn-out bellows, thin but serviceable. These components accumulated in a small hole Bob had dug beneath his sleeping pallet, wrapped in oilcloth he'd taken from the forge supply room. The most crucial theft came 4 days before Hendrix's planned departure. Bob had been watching the forge's tool inventory for weeks, noting which items received regular attention and which gathered dust. An old draw knife hung on the back wall, its blade pitted with rust, apparently forgotten. Bob waited until the end of a 14-hour shift, when exhaustion made the other workers sloppy in their awareness. As he cleaned his work area, a task he always performed with exaggerated thoroughness, he palmed the draw knife and slid it into his pants, secured against his leg by his belt. The walk back to the cabin took all his discipline, each step measured, his face carefully neutral despite the sharp edge pressing into his thigh. That night, after the others slept, Bob worked by moonlight filtering through the cabin's gaps. Using a piece of sandstone he'd collected, he began the slow process of removing the rust from the draw knife's blade. The work required patience and silence. Any unusual sound might wake one of the other men. He worked for perhaps an hour, making steady progress, before hiding his tools and lying back down to stare at the ceiling until dawn. Food presented a different challenge. The plantation's food distribution was carefully measured, calculated to provide just enough calories to keep workers functional without any excess. Bob couldn't simply hoard his portions. The resulting weakness would be noticed and questioned. Instead, he began a campaign of small thefts from the plantation's stores. A handful of cornmeal here, a piece of salt pork there, items taken in quantities small enough to be attributed to rats or spoilage. He stored these stolen supplies with his tools, wrapped tightly to protect them from moisture and vermin. Isaiah watched these preparations with knowing eyes, but said nothing directly. One evening, as they sat outside the cabin in the brief window of freedom between supper and mandatory return indoors, the older man spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Man planning to go into the mountains, he needs to know about the cold," Isaiah said, apparently to no one in particular. "Them high peaks, they got snow even in summer sometimes, and the nights, they'll freeze you solid if you ain't prepared. Fire's good, but smoke gives you away. Better to know how to find the caves, the places where the earth keeps its warmth." Bob said nothing, but he listened. Isaiah continued, still not looking at him directly. "The white folks, they patrol the roads and the gaps, the low places where trails cross from one valley to another. But there's high country they don't touch, places too rough for horses. A man knowing how to read the land, he can move through there. Follow the ridgelines instead of the valleys. Water flows down, but freedom might flow up." Over the following days, Isaiah passed along fragments of knowledge like precious gifts. How to identify north by the moss on trees when clouds hid the stars, which plants had edible roots, how to move through laurel thickets without leaving obvious trails. The older man never asked Bob directly about his plans, maintaining a plausible deniability that might protect him when questions came later. But his teaching was deliberate and comprehensive, the knowledge of someone who had perhaps contemplated escape himself and wanted to see his accumulated wisdom put to use. The day Hendrix and Webb departed dawned grey and cool, with fog lying thick in the valley. Bob watched from the forge as the colonel's carriage rolled away, followed by Webb on horseback. Porter, the assistant overseer, stood on the plantation house's porch, already looking bored with his temporary authority. He was perhaps 25, the nephew of a wealthy merchant in Asheville, learning plantation management with obvious reluctance. Bob had observed him carefully over the past months, noting his patterns. Porter made his rounds in the morning and then typically retired to the overseer's house, where he spent afternoons drinking and reading novels. The enslaved workers had learned to exploit these absences, stretching their work slower, taking unauthorized breaks, stealing small moments of autonomy. Bob decided to wait 3 days. Running the first night would be too obvious. Porter might still be alert, wanting to prove himself capable. But by the 3rd or 4th night, the young man's vigilance would fade into routine negligence. The moon was waxing toward full, which would provide light for travel while also making Bob more visible if anyone came looking. It was a calculated risk, but the alternative, waiting for a new moon weeks away, felt impossible. The decision had been made, and delay would only corrode his resolve. Those 3 days were an exercise in controlled terror. Bob moved through his work in a state of hyper-awareness, noting everything. The weather patterns, storms could provide cover, but also create dangerous conditions in the mountains. The behavior of the other workers, any unusual attention or suspicion, could doom his plans. The routines of Porter and the handful of white workers who kept the plantation functioning. He memorized schedules, counted hours, estimated distances. On the 2nd night, Bob completed his most important preparation. Using the draw knife he'd restored and a piece of the steel rod, he forged a crude but functional knife in the few minutes when he had access to the forge fire alone. The work was hasty, the blade unrefined, but it would hold an edge. He fashioned a handle from the leather strap, wrapping it tightly and securing it with wire. The result wouldn't win any prizes for craftsmanship, but it was a weapon and a tool. The difference between being merely an escaped enslaved person and being someone equipped to survive. The 3rd day arrived with weather that seemed scripted for drama. Dark clouds built throughout the afternoon, and by evening the smell of approaching rain filled the air. Bob ate his supper, cornmeal mush and a small piece of fatty pork, with deliberate slowness, forcing himself to consume every bite despite the nervousness that killed his appetite. He would need the energy. After the evening meal, the workers returned to their cabins. This was the dangerous window, the hour or two before full darkness, when movement might still be visible. Bob lay on his pallet waiting, listening to the sounds of the other men settling in. Thomas snored almost immediately. Isaiah remained awake longer, his breathing pattern indicating consciousness, but he asked no questions. Slowly, one by one, the others drifted into sleep. Bob waited until he heard Porter's uneven footsteps pass by the cabin, the assistant overseer making his nightly rounds, such as they were. The young man's boots scraped against gravel, accompanied by the clink of a bottle. Drunk again, or at least drinking. Perfect. When the plantation had been quiet for what felt like an hour, Bob moved. He retrieved his hidden supplies, stuffing them into a canvas sack he'd fashioned from an old feed bag. The knife went into his belt, hidden under his shirt. He had one change of clothes, stolen piece by piece over the past weeks, a warmer shirt and a pair of pants less ragged than his work clothes, food, flint and steel for fire-making, a small tin cup. It wasn't much, but it was everything he owned that wasn't owned by someone else first. At the cabin door, Bob paused. Isaiah's voice came from the darkness, so soft it was almost imagined. "Go with God, brother. May the mountains hide you well." Bob wanted to respond, to thank this man who had given him the knowledge that might mean survival, but speech felt too dangerous, too final. Instead, he simply opened the door and stepped into the night. The rain had started, a light drizzle that would build into something heavier. Bob blessed it silently. Rain would cover his scent from dogs and wash away his tracks. The plantation lay quiet around him, a collection of dark shapes against a darker sky. He could see lamplight in Porter's house, the assistant overseer presumably drinking himself into insensibility. The main house stood dark, its white columns ghostly in the faint moonlight that filtered through clouds. Bob moved toward the tree line, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. Running made noise, created panic, drew attention. Instead, he walked with purpose, as if he had legitimate business, as if he was still following orders. If someone saw him, the first few seconds of their reaction would be shaped by his demeanor. Purpose looked different than flight. The distance to the forest's edge was perhaps 200 yards. Bob covered it in what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. Each step took him further from the only world he'd known for 12 years, closer to the unknown vastness of the mountains. Behind him, the forge's chimney rose like a monument to his stolen years. Ahead, darkness waited, the darkness of the forest, of uncertainty. To have a future that was his own, even if it meant death. At the tree line, Bob paused and looked back one final time. The Hendricks plantation spread across the valley, smoke rising from evening fires, the river reflecting fragments of cloud-filtered moonlight. Somewhere in those cabins and work buildings were 62 people still bound by chains, visible and invisible, people who would wake tomorrow to the same hell they'd known yesterday. Bob felt the weight of their continued bondage, the guilt of being the one who chose to leave, but he could not save them. He could barely save himself, and perhaps if he succeeded, his absence would plant seeds in their minds, the possibility that the system could be defied, that the mountains offered refuge, that freedom was more than an abstract concept from a world that felt as distant as the stars. Bob turned and entered the forest. The trees swallowed him immediately, their branches creating a canopy that blocked even the minimal light from the cloud-covered sky. He moved by feel, hands extended, feet testing each step before committing his weight. The rain intensified, heavy drops penetrating the leafy cover, soaking through his clothes within minutes. Behind him, the plantation continued its nightly routine, unaware that one piece of its human inventory had just subtracted itself from the ledger. It would be hours yet before anyone noticed, possibly not until morning roll call. Bob intended to use every second of that head start. He climbed. The mountains rose to the west, their slopes steep enough to make ascent a matter of constant effort. Bob followed what seemed to be a game trail, a path worn by deer or other animals seeking higher ground. The rain made everything slippery, and twice he fell, catching himself on saplings, mudding his clothes, scraping his hands on rocks and roots. Each fall came with a spike of fear. Injury now could be fatal, could slow him enough for capture. The night became a blur of physical exertion and mental focus. Bob counted his steps, trying to estimate distance traveled. He paused regularly to listen for sounds of pursuit. Though he knew it was too early for organized searching, his body ached from the climb, his ribs still tender from webs beating weeks earlier. The rain continued, relentless and cold, the temperature dropping as he gained elevation. After what might have been 3 hours, time became difficult to measure in the darkness. Bob reached a small plateau where the terrain flattened temporarily. He allowed himself a brief rest, leaning against a large oak, trying to catch his breath. His clothes were soaked through and he was starting to shiver. The night temperature wasn't severe, but wet cold could kill as surely as freezing temperatures. Bob forced himself to move again. Stopping was dangerous. His muscles would stiffen, his resolve might weaken, and the cold could become disabling. He continued climbing, pushing west and north, away from the plantation, deeper into the mountains that rose in successive ridges toward the highest peaks. The forest around him was alive with night sounds, owls calling, small animals rustling through undergrowth, the constant patter of rain on leaves. It felt simultaneously threatening and welcoming, a world operating by rules different from those that governed human civilization. Dawn came slowly, the darkness gradually diluting into gray. Bob had been moving for perhaps 6 hours, and his body screamed for rest, but first light would bring the discovery of his absence, would trigger the machinery of pursuit. He needed to find shelter, a place where he could rest hidden while patrols searched the more accessible areas. The rain had stopped, and a weak sun tried to penetrate the clouds. Bob stood on a mountainside, looking down at valleys that stretched away in misty layers. Somewhere down there was the Hendricks plantation, already beginning its daily routine, the forge hammer about to fall and find no one there to swing it. Bob allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. That hammer would stay silent today, at least where his labor was concerned. Then he turned and continued climbing, searching for the high country Isaiah had described, the places where white patrols wouldn't venture. He was free now, in the most technical sense. But freedom without survival was just a different kind of death. The real test was only beginning. The morning of Bob's disappearance began like any other on the Hendricks plantation. The plantation bell rang at 5:30, its iron voice cutting through the dawn mist that hung over the valley. In the forge quarters, 7 men rose from their pallets, muscles stiff from yesterday's labor, preparing for another day of heat and metal and endless repetition. It took perhaps 5 minutes for someone to notice that Bob's pallet was empty, his few possessions gone. Thomas found the small hole beneath where Bob had slept, the disturbed earth evidence of careful excavation. He said nothing, simply smoothed the dirt back into place with his foot and walked outside. The other men understood immediately. They dressed in silence, a conspiracy of omission taking shape, without a single word spoken. When Porter came for the morning count, stumbling slightly from his previous night's drinking, they stood in their usual line. The assistant overseer's bloodshot eyes moved across their faces, counting mechanically. "Where's Bob?" Porter's voice carried irritation rather than alarm. "Don't know, sir," Thomas said. "Ain't seen him this morning." Porter's face went through several expressions: confusion, then concern, then a dawning horror as he realized what this meant. An enslaved person missing on his watch, with the colonel away. This was the kind of failure that could destroy a young man's prospects, could brand him as incompetent in a society where managing enslaved people was considered a basic marker of white male capability. "Search the area," Porter ordered, his voice rising. "Check the other cabins, the forge, the barns. Maybe he's sick somewhere or injured." But they all knew. The missing possessions, the night's rain that had conveniently washed away tracks, the timing during Hendrix's absence, everything pointed to escape. By 7 o'clock, with Bob nowhere on the plantation grounds, Porter had to face reality. He sent a rider to Asheville to inform the colonel and began organizing a search party from the available white workers and trusted enslaved people who served as drivers. Bob, meanwhile, had found temporary shelter in a limestone cave, perhaps 8 miles from the plantation. The cave entrance was partially concealed by a rockfall and thick mountain laurel, the kind of place you'd only find if you were looking specifically or if you stumbled upon it by accident. Isaiah's descriptions had been accurate. The mountains were riddled with such hiding places, geological wrinkles where a person could vanish. Inside, the cave extended back perhaps 30 feet before narrowing to a crawl space Bob had no intention of exploring. The floor was dry, covered in a layer of sandy soil and small rocks. Animal scat indicated that something, possibly bears, used this space seasonally, but the droppings looked old, desiccated. Bob was gambling that whatever creature claimed this cave wasn't currently in residence. He collapsed against the cave's back wall, finally allowing his body to fully feel the night's exertion. His legs trembled with exhaustion, his lungs burned, and his hands were cut in a dozen places from grabbing rocks and branches in the darkness. But he was alive, and for the moment, hidden. Outside, the morning brightened, sun breaking through the cloud cover, steam rising from wet vegetation as the forest began to dry. Bob knew he couldn't stay here long. Once the patrols organized, they would search caves within a day's walk of the plantation. This was just a temporary refuge, a place to rest and plan his next move. He allowed himself 2 hours of sleep, sitting upright against the stone wall, his knife in his hand, every sense still partially alert for danger. When he woke, the sun was higher, and he could hear birds calling outside, the normal sounds of a forest undisturbed by human intrusion. Bob ate sparingly from his stolen supplies, forcing himself to chew slowly despite his hunger. Food was survival now, and he had no idea when he'd be able to safely steal or forage more. His plan, such as it was, involved moving deeper into the mountains, following the ridgelines as Isaiah had advised. The highest peaks offered the most isolation, the least likelihood of stumbling upon settlements or encountering patrols. But they also presented the greatest physical challenges: terrain so rough that travel would be slow and exhausting, weather that could turn deadly without warning, and the constant risk of injury far from any possibility of help. Bob spent the afternoon organizing his supplies and preparing for the next stage of travel. He used his knife to cut a walking stick from a fallen branch, trimming and smoothing it into something that could help with balance on steep slopes. He fashioned a crude pack from his canvas sack, adding straps made from twisted vines that would allow him to carry his possessions on his back, keeping his hands free for climbing. As evening approached, Bob prepared to move again. Travel at night was slower and more dangerous, but it reduced the risk of being spotted. He was operating in the space between impossibilities, moving fast enough to stay ahead of pursuit, but carefully enough to avoid the injuries that would end his flight. He emerged from the cave as dusk settled over the mountains, the sky turning that particular shade of purple that occurs in the moments between day and night. The forest was quieter now, the daytime birds settling, the nighttime creatures not yet active. Bob oriented himself by the fading light, identifying west by the sunset's position, and began climbing again. If you're still with us on this journey, we'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about Bob's story. These forgotten histories deserve to be remembered, and your engagement helps us bring more of them to light. The next 3 days existed as a blur of constant motion, punctuated by brief periods of hidden rest. Bob moved at night when possible, sleeping in daylight in whatever concealment he could find. Dense rhododendron thickets, rock overhangs, once in the hollow of a massive fallen chestnut tree. He saw no one, which was both reassuring and isolating. The absence of pursuit might mean he'd gained a substantial lead, or it might mean the patrols were being strategic, setting up barriers further ahead rather than chasing immediately. He learned the rhythms of the mountains through necessity. Water sources became his primary navigation points, small streams that trickled down from higher elevations, springs that emerged from rock faces, pools that collected in depressions. He followed ridgelines that ran roughly northwest, keeping the highest peaks to his right, using them as landmarks visible even at night when the moon provided enough light. The physical toll accumulated relentlessly. Bob's boots, already worn when he fled, began to fall apart. The sole of his right boot separated from the upper, forcing him to tie it in place with strips of cloth. His feet developed blisters that burst and bled, making each step a conscious exercise in pain management. He ran out of cornmeal on the 4th day and began eating whatever seemed edible. Roots he dug with his knife, berries he recognized from descriptions Isaiah had given him. Once a snake he killed with a rock and roasted over a tiny fire built in a natural depression that would hide the smoke. On the 5th night, Bob heard dogs for the first time. The baying carried across valleys, echoing off rock faces, making it impossible to judge precise distance or direction. But dogs meant organized pursuit, meant patrols with resources and determination. He altered his path, heading toward a creek and walking in the water for nearly a mile, a technique he'd heard described for breaking his scent trail. The cold water numbed his feet, and he nearly fell several times on slick rocks. But he pushed through, climbing out only when he reached a point where the creek cascaded down a steep rock face, too vertical for dogs to follow easily. The dogs' sounds faded behind him, but the knowledge that they were out there hunting him added new urgency to his flight. Bob pushed harder, sleeping less, ignoring the protests of his body. He was operating now on something beyond normal endurance, a combination of fear, determination, and the simple impossibility of giving up after coming this far. On the 7th day, Bob reached a landscape that seemed to exist outside normal geography. The trees here were stunted by elevation and exposure, their trunks twisted by constant wind, their branches flagged toward the east by prevailing weather patterns. Rocky balds, areas where no trees grew at all, opened up views that stretched for dozens of miles. Bob stood on one such bald, breathing hard from the climb, looking at a world of mountains layering away into blue distance. He had never seen anything like this. The plantation valley, which had once seemed to encompass his entire universe, would be invisible from here, just another fold in the endless corrugation of the landscape. But beauty provided no calories, no healing for his deteriorating physical condition. Bob was losing weight rapidly, his body consuming itself to fuel the constant exertion. His ribs, already visible before the escape, now stood out prominently. His face had hollowed, his eyes sitting deeper in their sockets. The cuts on his hands had become infected, red lines radiating from some of the deeper wounds. He knew, with the practical knowledge of someone who'd seen workplace injuries turn fatal, that infection could kill him as surely as capture. He needed to find a place to stop, to truly rest and recover, not just collapse for a few hours before moving again. But where? The high country offered concealment but little in terms of resources. No shelter beyond what nature randomly provided, no reliable food sources, no way to treat his wounds. The calculation he'd made on the plantation, that freedom in the mountains was preferable to bondage in the valley, now faced its real test. Freedom while dying of exposure and starvation wasn't really freedom at all. On the 8th night, Bob found what would become his salvation and his prison for the next several weeks. A box canyon, its entrance narrow and partially concealed by a rockfall, opened into a sheltered area, perhaps 100 yards across. A spring emerged from the back wall, creating a small pool before the water trickled away through gaps in the rock. The canyon's high walls would trap heat during the day and provide protection from wind. More importantly, it was defensible. The narrow entrance meant that anyone trying to come in would have to do so single file, visible long before they could reach the canyon's interior. Bob stood at the entrance as dawn broke, evaluating the space with the strategic thinking that had kept him alive this long. This could work. This could be a base, a place to recover strength before pushing deeper into the mountains, or, and this thought felt both thrilling and terrifying, a place to actually live, at least for a time. He spent the next 2 days fortifying his refuge. Using rocks and fallen branches, he created a crude barrier across the canyon's entrance, leaving a gap large enough to pass through but small enough to defend. He built a fire pit against the back wall where the cliff's overhang would disperse smoke, making it less visible from a distance. He gathered firewood, carrying load after load from the surrounding forest, building a supply that would last weeks. He explored the canyon thoroughly, finding a small cave, really more of an indentation, where he could sleep protected from rain. Food remained the critical problem. Bob set snares made from wire he'd stolen from the plantation, placing them along what appeared to be rabbit trails near the canyon. He had limited success, 1 rabbit in 3 days, but it was something. He expanded his foraging, eating plants he would have considered inedible before, testing small amounts first to ensure they didn't make him sick. Acorns, boiled repeatedly to leach out the bitterness. Wild onions, the inner bark of certain trees, scraped and cooked until it became almost palatable. The infected cuts on his hands worried him most. He had no medicine, no knowledge of healing beyond the folk remedies he'd heard discussed in the plantation quarters. He tried what he remembered. Mashed plantain leaves applied as a poultice, changing the dressing daily. The infection slowly retreated, the red lines fading, though his hands remained stiff and painful. 3 weeks after his escape, Bob stood at his canyon's entrance watching the sun set over ranges of mountains that extended to the horizon. He was still a fugitive, still hunted, still fundamentally alone in a way few humans ever experience. But he was also something he hadn't been since childhood: free. Not free in the abstract sense that white people discussed in their political speeches, but free in the immediate physical reality of choosing where to sleep, what to eat, when to wake. The simple autonomy of his own life. Yet freedom came with a cost he hadn't fully anticipated. The isolation pressed on him like a physical weight. Days passed where he didn't speak aloud, where the only sounds were natural: wind, water, birds, his own breathing. He found himself talking to himself just to hear a human voice, holding conversations with imagined companions. At night, memories of the plantation would surface unbidden, not nostalgia for bondage, but longing for human connection, for the community of the forge quarters, for Isaiah's quiet wisdom and Thomas's occasional laugh. Summer settled over the mountains with a weight that felt almost tangible. The days grew longer and hotter, though the elevation kept temperatures more bearable than in the valleys below. Bob's Canyon became a small world unto itself, a pocket of existence carved from the wilderness through sheer determination and daily labor. He had survived a month, then 2, each day a small victory against the forces, both human and natural, that sought to eliminate him. The physical transformation was remarkable. The forge worker's body, built for repetitive hammering, had been replaced by something leaner and more versatile. Bob's weight had stabilized at a level far below his plantation mass, but the remaining muscle was functional, adapted to climbing, foraging, and the constant physical problem-solving that mountain survival required. His hands, once specialized for gripping a sledgehammer, had developed new calluses, new patterns of wear. The infected cuts healed slowly, leaving scars that would mark him for life. But it was the mental transformation that ran deeper. Bob discovered capacities within himself that slavery had never allowed to develop. Problem-solving became a daily meditation. How to improve his snares, how to preserve meat for longer periods, how to make his fire pit more efficient. He developed an intimacy with weather patterns, learning to read the sky like a language, predicting rain hours before it arrived by the behavior of birds and the quality of light. He became a student of animal behavior, noting which trails were used regularly, which times of day different creatures moved through his territory. The canyon itself evolved under his attention. What had been a random geological formation became something approaching a homestead. Bob constructed a more substantial shelter against the back wall, using rocks chinked with mud and a roof of interwoven branches covered with bark. Inside, he created a platform that kept him off the ground, reducing the cold that seeped up through stone at night. He built storage, crude but functional, for his food supplies and tools. A drying rack near his fire allowed him to preserve meat and fish from the small stream that flowed through a valley below his canyon. Fish became a crucial protein source. Bob fashioned a spear from a straight sapling, fire-hardening the point and sharpening it with his knife. The technique required patience and practice, standing motionless in cold water, watching for the shadow shapes of trout, striking with a speed that had to overcome water's refraction. His first dozen attempts yielded nothing but splashes and frustration, but gradually he developed the skill, the timing, the predatory patience that fishing required. A successful spearing meant protein that would last several days when properly smoked over his fire. Yet survival, Bob discovered, was different from living. He had achieved the former, but the latter remained elusive. The isolation grounded him in ways physical hardship never could. He found himself replaying conversations from years ago, turning them over in his mind like precious artifacts. He remembered the sound of his mother's voice, though her face had faded to a blur. He thought about the other workers at the forge, wondered if they'd been punished for his escape, hoped that Isaiah had survived whatever questions Porter had asked. The guilt of having left them haunted his nights. Bob would lie in his shelter, listening to the night sounds of the forest, and feel the weight of those 62 people still trapped in bondage. He had saved himself but abandoned them. The logic that insisted individual survival didn't equate to collective betrayal warred with the emotional reality that he was here, free, while they remained in chains. In late July, Bob saw his first humans since the escape. He was hunting perhaps a mile from his canyon, moving quietly through dense forest, when voices carried through the trees. He froze immediately, every muscle tensing, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. The voices were white, male, speaking casually about hunting prospects. Bob slowly lowered himself behind a fallen log, making himself as small and invisible as possible. Two men emerged into view, both carrying rifles, moving with the confident carelessness of people who believed they owned the landscape. They were hunters, not patrols. Their conversation focused on deer and turkey, not runaway slaves, but their presence represented a violation of the sanctuary Bob had believed he'd found. The mountains weren't as empty as he'd hoped. White people moved through them, claimed them, treated them as extension of the world below. Bob remained motionless for over an hour after the hunters passed, waiting until he was absolutely certain they'd moved beyond any possibility of detecting him. Then he crept back to his canyon, moving with exaggerated caution, checking constantly for any sign of human presence. That night he didn't light a fire, didn't cook, just sat in darkness eating dried meat and thinking about the implications of what he'd seen. The encounter forced a recalibration of his assumptions. He wasn't as isolated as he'd believed. The mountains had boundaries, limits to their protection. White settlements existed scattered through these ranges. Small farms, hunting camps, isolated homesteads of people seeking their own version of independence from civilization. Any of them might stumble upon his canyon. Any of them represented potential disaster. Bob began ranging further from his base, conducting reconnaissance missions that lasted full days. He needed to understand the human geography of his refuge, to know where the boundaries of safety lay. What he discovered was sobering. A rough trail existed about 3 miles to the east, barely more than a footpath, but clearly used regularly. To the south, perhaps 5 miles away, he found evidence of a small settlement, cleared land, the remains of a campfire, bootprints in soft earth near a stream. He was living in the gaps between occupation, in spaces that white settlers hadn't yet claimed or couldn't easily access. But those gaps were smaller than he'd imagined, and they were shrinking. The expansion of white civilization was relentless, pushing into every corner of the landscape, claiming it, naming it, fencing it. August brought different challenges. Berries ripened throughout the forest, blackberries, blueberries, service berries, providing a dietary variety Bob had almost forgotten existed. He gorged on them, eating until his fingers were stained purple, knowing this abundance was temporary. He attempted to preserve some by drying them in the sun, with mixed success. Most molded before they fully dried, but he salvaged enough to add to his stores. The abundance of food allowed Bob to focus on other improvements. He worked on his clothing, which had deteriorated badly during the escape and subsequent weeks. Using a bone needle he'd fashioned and thread made from plant fibers, he attempted repairs that were functional if not beautiful. He constructed better footwear from deer hide. A rabbit he'd snared turned out to be a small deer that had somehow gotten caught in one of his snares, a gift that provided both meat and material. The hide, properly prepared and shaped, made foot coverings vastly superior to his disintegrating plantation boots. But the deer also represented a problem. Its disappearance wouldn't go unnoticed if it had been near someone's land. White settlers tracked their game carefully, noticed when animals that should be there weren't. Bob worried that his hunting might create patterns that observant eyes could detect. He became even more cautious, varying his hunting grounds, taking care to leave no obvious traces of his activities. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the high country. Bob began preparing for winter with a growing sense of urgency. He had survived 3 months, but winter in these mountains would be an entirely different challenge. He needed more substantial shelter, a larger food reserve, warmer clothing. The list of preparations seemed endless, and time was accelerating toward the cold months with inevitable momentum. He started gathering materials for winter: deadfall wood for extended fires, bark for insulation, stones to improve his shelter's walls. Each day became a race against the calendar, a calculation of what he could accomplish before conditions made certain tasks impossible. He needed to catch and preserve fish before the streams began to freeze. He needed to gather nuts before other animals stripped the trees bare. He needed to improve his shelter before his hands became too cold to work effectively. The isolation intensified as days shortened. Bob found himself creating elaborate mental conversations with people from his past, sometimes arguing aloud with imagined overseers, sometimes explaining his situation to his long-gone mother. He knew this was a sign of deteriorating mental state, but the awareness didn't stop the behavior. The human need for social connection was too fundamental to simply override through willpower. One evening in late September, Bob sat at his canyon's entrance, watching the sunset paint the mountains in layers of orange and purple. A thought occurred to him with crystalline clarity. He had become what white people had always claimed to fear most, a man outside their control, beyond their laws, answerable to nothing but his own conscience and the demands of survival. He was the nightmare that justified their patrols, their restrictions, their entire apparatus of control. But he was also just a person trying to live, no different in his basic needs and desires than any other human. The mountains didn't care about his race or his legal status. The cold would kill him just as readily as it would kill a white person. The hunger gnawed at his belly with democratic impartiality. Nature, at least, was honest in its indifference. In early October, Bob made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. He needed supplies, real supplies, not just what he could make or find. He needed metal tools that he couldn't forge without proper equipment. He needed salt for preserving meat. He needed cloth that would actually hold warmth, which meant he needed to risk approaching human civilization, to steal from the people who were hunting him. He spent a week observing a small farmstead about 6 miles from his canyon. The family, a man, a woman, 2 children, lived in a log cabin surrounded by cleared land. They had a barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar. Bob watched their routines from concealment, noting their schedules, their patterns. The man hunted most mornings. The woman worked in the garden. The children did chores around the property. The smokehouse was the target. Bob could see cured meat hanging inside through gaps in the walls. Taking food from these people felt different than stealing from the plantation. This family worked their own land, wasn't built on enslaved labor, but Bob's need outweighed his ethical qualms. Survival was its own morality. He struck on a cloudy night when the moon was hidden. Moving with agonizing slowness, Bob approached the smokehouse from the forest side, where shadows were deepest. The door had a simple latch, no lock. Who would expect thieves this far from settlements? Inside, the smell of smoked meat made his mouth water, despite the fear flooding his system. He took 2 hams, not so many that their absence would be immediately obvious, but enough to make a difference to his winter prospects. The trip back to his canyon took hours. Every step weighted with the expectation of discovery, of dogs suddenly barking, of voices raised in alarm. But the night remained quiet except for natural sounds. Bob reached his refuge as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, his heart still hammering from adrenaline, the stolen hams a heavy weight in his improvised pack. As he stored his prize, carefully wrapping the meat and hanging it from a beam in his shelter, where it would stay cool and protected from animals, Bob felt a complex mixture of emotions. Triumph at having successfully stolen what he needed, guilt for taking from people who'd done him no direct harm, and underneath everything, a profound exhaustion, not physical, but existential. This was his life now, hiding, stealing, constantly calculating survival margins, existing in the spaces between other people's awareness. The question that haunted him as winter approached wasn't whether he could survive the cold months. He believed he could, given luck and continued effort. The question was whether surviving was the same as living, whether freedom without human connection had any real meaning, whether he was building a life or just extending his death across many months, instead of experiencing it all at once on a plantation whipping post. Bob had no answers. He only had the next day, and the day after that, and the slow turn of seasons that would eventually reveal whether his gamble on the mountains had been wisdom or delusion. For now, he was alive and free. That would have to be enough. Winter arrived in the North Carolina mountains, not as a single event, but as a gradual tightening of conditions, each day slightly harder than the last. The first snow fell in late October, light flurries that melted by midday, but announced the coming transformation. Bob watched the white flakes drift down into his canyon with a mixture of wonder. He'd never seen snow before his escape, and dread at what this beauty represented in terms of survival challenges. By early November, The high country had committed fully to winter. Snow accumulated in sheltered areas, ice formed on the edges of streams, and the temperature at night dropped below freezing with regularity. Bob's Canyon, which had seemed like a refuge during summer and fall, now felt exposed in new ways. Wind howled through gaps in his shelter's walls. The stone floor radiated cold that no amount of fire seemed to fully counteract. His carefully gathered firewood, which had seemed like an abundant supply, burned with alarming speed. The isolation Bob had experienced during warmer months intensified into something that approached madness at the edges. Days passed where his only activities were maintaining his fire, melting snow for water, and eating small portions of his preserved food. The shortened daylight meant long hours of darkness, 16, 17 hours per night, spent lying in his shelter, trying to conserve body heat. His mind cycling through memories and imagined conversations. He developed rituals to maintain sanity. Each morning, he would stand at the canyon entrance, weather permitting, and speak aloud a summary of his situation. "My name is Bob. I am a free man. I escaped from the Hendricks plantation on May 8, 1845. I have survived 6 months. I will survive this winter." The words, spoken to an empty landscape, served as anchors to reality, reminders that he was still a person with a history and a future, not just an animal struggling for survival. The stolen hams sustained him through December, carefully rationed. Bob would cut thin slices, cooking them slowly over his fire, making each piece last. But by Christmas, a date he marked by scratching a line on the wall of his shelter, having kept count of days since his escape, the meat was nearly gone. His other food supplies were depleting faster than he'd planned. The dried fish, the preserved berries, the nuts he'd gathered, all seemed inadequate against the relentless hunger that came from trying to stay warm in freezing conditions. January brought the worst weather. A blizzard swept through the mountains, dropping snow that accumulated 3 feet deep in Bob's Canyon. For 4 days, he was effectively trapped in his shelter, unable to venture out even to gather firewood from his stockpile just outside. The temperature plummeted. Bob huddled close to his fire, feeding it constantly, watching his wood supply vanish into heat that seemed to dissipate almost immediately. On the 4th day of the blizzard, Bob ran out of firewood inside his shelter. The storm still raged outside, wind-driven snow reducing visibility to a few feet. He had a choice: venture out to his woodpile, risking exposure and possibly getting lost in whiteout conditions, or let his fire die and try to survive on body heat alone. Neither option felt survivable. He chose action. Wrapping himself in every piece of clothing and hide he possessed, Bob tied a rope around his waist and secured the other end to a support beam in his shelter. The rope would be his lifeline, a way to find his way back if the storm's disorientation became total. Then he pushed out into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making his eyes water immediately. Wind drove snow horizontally, coating him in white within seconds. Bob could barely see his own hands extended in front of him. He knew his woodpile was approximately 20 feet to the left of his shelter entrance, but in the whiteout, direction became theoretical. He moved by feel, one hand on the canyon wall, feet shuffling forward through thigh-deep snow. Each step was exhausting, the cold penetrating his layered clothing with cruel efficiency. His face went numb within seconds. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, his hand found the woodpile, snow-covered but still there. Bob loaded his arms with as much wood as he could carry, an awkward bundle that threw off his balance. The return trip was worse. He couldn't see at all with the wood blocking his view, had to navigate purely by the rope around his waist, pulling himself hand over hand back toward his shelter. Twice he fell, the wood scattering, forcing him to gather it again in the snow, his hands screaming with cold. When he finally stumbled back into his shelter, Bob collapsed on the floor, dropping the wood, his body shaking so violently he could barely function. It took 15 minutes before he could coordinate his movements enough to rebuild the fire. His hands wouldn't work properly, fingers clumsy and unresponsive. He fumbled with flint and steel, striking again and again, until finally a spark caught in the tinder he'd prepared. As the fire grew and warmth began to return to his body, Bob understood how close he'd come to death. Another hour without fire, and hypothermia would have taken him. He'd survived by the narrowest margin, and winter was far from over. The blizzard passed, but it left the landscape transformed. Snow covered everything, obliterating familiar landmarks, making travel nearly impossible. Bob's snares were buried and useless. Hunting was out of the question. He had no way to track animals through the deep snow, and even if he could, the exertion would burn calories he couldn't afford to spend. By mid-February, Bob was starving in the clinical sense. His food supplies were exhausted. He'd eaten the last of everything, the final scraps of dried meat, the remnants of nuts that had started to mold, even bark he'd stripped from certain trees and boiled into a barely edible paste. His body, already lean from months of mountain life, began consuming itself. His ribs stood out prominently, his face hollowed into a skull-like mask. His movements became slow and deliberate as his body conserved every possible calorie. Starvation brought a strange clarity. The constant mental chatter that had plagued Bob during the early months of isolation quieted. His mind became focused on an almost meditative level on the immediate requirements of survival: water, melted from snow; warmth, maintained through carefully managed fire; movement, reduced to the absolute minimum. He found himself thinking about the plantation with something that wasn't quite nostalgia, but wasn't entirely different. At least there, he'd been fed. Not well, never enough, but with predictable regularity. The irony didn't escape him. He'd traded the certainty of oppression for the uncertainty of freedom, and the freedom was killing him by inches. On a day in late February that Bob almost didn't have the strength to mark on his wall, he heard dogs again. The baying carried across the snow-covered landscape, echoing off frozen cliffs, multiplying until it seemed like 100 hounds rather than however many were actually out there. But this time the sound was different, more distant, moving in a different direction. Not hunting him, but hunting something else. Deer, probably. Or perhaps hunting for sport. Bob listened to the dogs fade into distance, and a realization crystallized. The patrols had given up. 9 months had passed since his escape. Hendricks had either written off the loss of one enslaved person or assumed that Bob had died in the mountains. The active searching had stopped. He was free in a more complete sense than before. Not just escaped, but forgotten. Erased from the ledgers that had once defined his existence. The realization should have brought joy, but Bob felt nothing except the gnawing emptiness of hunger. Freedom meant little when he was dying. He needed food, which meant he needed to take another risk, to venture back to areas where human settlement might provide opportunities for theft. In early March, as the first hints of spring began to show in marginally warmer days and the occasional patch of bare ground where sun hit directly, Bob left his canyon. He was weak, dangerously so, but staying meant certain death. Moving meant possible death, which was mathematically superior. The journey to the farmstead he'd robbed before took 2 full days, a trip that should have taken half a day. Bob had to rest frequently, his weakened body unable to sustain effort for long periods. He ate snow for water, but it provided no calories, no actual sustenance. By the time he reached a vantage point overlooking the farm, he was operating on something beyond normal consciousness, a survival instinct that animated his body even when rational thought had become difficult. He watched the farm for hours, noting that the family had grown, a new infant visible through the cabin's window when the woman moved past. The man still went hunting most mornings, still followed predictable patterns. The smokehouse remained the obvious target, but Bob noticed something new, a root cellar, its door partially visible where snow had melted away. Root vegetables, potatoes, turnips, carrots, foods that would last. That would provide calories his body desperately needed. Bob waited until nightfall, gathering what remained of his strength for one final push. If this failed, if he was caught, he would either die fighting or die in captivity. He had moved beyond caring which. The approach to the root cellar took an hour, every movement slow and calculated. Bob's vision narrowed, tunnel-like, his body's response to insufficient blood sugar. He reached the cellar door, found it secured with a simple wooden bar. His shaking hands lifted the bar, and the door opened into cool darkness, smelling of earth and stored food. Inside, Bob's groping hands found potatoes, carrots, onions, a supply meant to last the family through spring. He took what he could carry in his makeshift pack, probably more than was wise, but he was beyond rational calculation. He was taking survival itself, packaged in root vegetables. The return trip to his canyon was a blur that Bob later remembered only in fragments. Walking through darkness, falling repeatedly, at some point eating a raw potato, unable to wait, his body demanding immediate fuel. The taste was earth and starch and life itself. He reached his canyon as dawn broke, stumbled into his shelter, and collapsed. For 3 days, Bob barely moved except to tend his fire and eat. He cooked the vegetables slowly, making them last, feeling strength return to his body incrementally. The root vegetables saved his life as surely as if someone had pulled him from drowning waters. As March progressed toward April and the mountains began their slow emergence from winter, Bob took stock. He had survived what should have been unsurvivable, 9 months as a fugitive, including a mountain winter that tested the limits of human endurance. He was changed, physically thinner, mentally harder, emotionally scarred by isolation, but he was alive and free. The question now was what came next. He couldn't survive another winter in the canyon without better preparation and more reliable food sources. He couldn't keep stealing from local farms without eventually being caught. He couldn't continue the complete isolation without losing his sanity entirely. Something would have to change. Bob began to formulate a new plan, one that felt both necessary and terrifying. He would move deeper into the mountains, into the truly remote areas where white settlement hadn't reached. He would become what the Cherokee had been before their removal, a mountain person. Someone who lived within the landscape, rather than merely hiding in it. He would learn to truly survive, not just endure. Spring brought new energy, new possibilities. The snow melted, revealing a landscape that had seemed dead, but was only dormant. Green shoots pushed up through wet earth. Animals emerged from hibernation. The forest filled with birdsong that Bob had forgotten during the silent months of winter. He used the improving weather to improve his skills. He practiced with his spear until he could take fish reliably. He built better snares, studied animal tracks, learned to identify edible plants as they emerged. He worked on his shelter, reinforcing walls and roof, preparing for the next winter that would inevitably come. But most importantly, Bob began the mental preparation for what he was becoming, not an escaped slave waiting to return to civilization, but a permanent exile, a person who had chosen the mountains over the world of human society. It was a choice that felt like both liberation and surrender, freedom bought at the price of everything that made a person part of the human community. In late April, almost exactly a year after his escape, Bob stood at the entrance to his canyon and looked back toward the valleys where plantations operated, where slavery continued its grinding brutality, where 62 people still lived the bondage he'd left behind. He felt the weight of their continued suffering, the guilt that came from being the one who got away, but he also felt something else, a fierce pride in his own survival, a recognition that his existence as a free person in these mountains was itself an act of resistance. Every day he survived was a day that proved enslaved people were fully human, capable of the same resilience and adaptation as any other person. His freedom, hard-won and maintained through suffering, was a testament that the system of slavery was built on lies. Bob turned away from the valleys and looked toward the higher peaks, toward the deeper wilderness that would be his home. He had been reborn in these mountains, had shed the identity of Bob the enslaved forge worker and become something new, a mountain man, a survivor, a person who existed outside the categories that society tried to impose. We've reached the end of Bob's first year of freedom, but his story continues in the mountains of North Carolina, where he would live for decades, becoming a legend whispered about in local communities, the escaped slave who couldn't be caught, the shadow in the high country, the man who chose wilderness over civilization. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten histories, and leave a comment telling us what you think about Bob's incredible journey. Thank you for watching. The story of Bob represents thousands of untold stories from the era of American slavery, stories of resistance, survival, and the indomitable human spirit that no system of oppression could fully extinguish. In the mountains of Appalachia, in swamps, in cities, in countless hidden spaces, enslaved people fought for their freedom in ways large and small. Bob's story is just one, but it carries the weight of all those others who risked everything for the simple, profound right to own their own lives.